Hi, welcome to Sandy Says. This is Sandy Dimiterchik, Director of Community Engagement at Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance, or S&PAA. This month, we are celebrating African American History Month, or Black History Month. I would like to introduce Zuhura Namibia, a volunteer at S&PAA as an SA group leader who is also a certified peer support specialist, and her grandson, Tarik Daniels, founder and CEO of the nonprofit organization What's in the Mirror. Today, we will talk about what this celebration means to each of us. Zahara, could you introduce yourself?
Well, I'm Zuhura Yanu Namibia Okir Afortiki, and it's an African name that I've taken on through rites of passage. Um, I'm going to talk about what Black history means to me and what and how it inspired me in my life today. Okay, first of all, I'm talking about Carter Goodwin Woodson. He was born December the 19th, 1875, and he died April the 3rd, 1950. He was an American historian, author, journalist, and the founder of the Association for the Study of African Americans' Life and History. He was one of the first scholars to study the history of the African diaspora, including African American history. He wrote his Miseducation of a Negro and other books. I didn't find this out until recently when in high school we were taught that George Washington Carver invention with the peanuts and Booker T. Washington was the only Black history that I ever had gotten. And we were taught that sometimes that something was wrong with American history. Um, 1986, Congress passed Public Law 99-244, which designated February 1986 as National Black America's History Month. This law noted that February the 1st, 1986, world marked the beginning of the annual public and private salute um, to Black of history. The law further directed the president to issue a proclamation. On February 7, 1926, Carter G. Woodson initiated the first celebration of Negro History Week, which led to Black History Month, to study, to extend and deepen the study and scholarship of an African American history all year long. My father, when I was about 9 years old, he set up a boycott against store merchants who were exploiting our community by selling products that were not new as new. We made signs and walked the picket line, and on the sign it asked us how we are, why we are walking. Um, we stayed outside the store until the store owners listened and understood that we were walking because of unfair practices. My father was a union representative whom had a supervisory position. He taught us that the system wasn't fair and that whites were over our livelihoods, were oppressing us, and would come around to cut our gas off or our lights or other services that they served in. He said that they were prejudiced. We had a rebellion after that, soon after, in our city in 1967, the Detroit Rebellion. In our neighborhood, I was angry about unfair treatment to African Americans. I left home shortly after giving birth I studied the situation in my immediate community. It was a calling for me to help change the wretched conditions of our people. And since they were racially unfair, we we are building a community of our own. I committed my whole life at the age of my second child. Her father was instrumental to this change and commitment. He is the nephew of activist Eartha Kitt. He was a teacher, reverend, bishop, and before he died, he was a cardinal of the PAOCC, formerly BCN. Let him rest. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the truth. Henceforth, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me that day. In my father's house, there were albums that had been brought to our attention from relatives who were Muslim and became followers of Honorable Elijah Muhammad. My brothers also followed teachings of the grassroots, How to Eat to Live by Elijah Muhammad. So my quest of about the liberation age was indoctrinated after joining an awareness of African America. In college, I read Nat Turner. He was very clear. I read autobiography of Malcolm X. Recently, I was able to understand. Uh, I read a book called Things Fall Apart, and that was pretty good book. I'm doing a little work from Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, using the 101 monkey potential, um, paving the way from one ancestor and setting with groups of like-mindedness. I read biography of Sojourner Truth, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Ida B. Wells was the most significant inspirations in my life because they are for women, Black women, fair justice and in the system of voter rights. Um, Sojourner Truth, she ended slavery. She was working with the abolition movement. Contributions to abolish slavery was the speech that she delivered in 1851 at Ohio Women's Rights Convention. She spoke powerfully about equal rights for Black women. Her famous quotes were, "Ain't I a woman?" She is a hero. She helped Black people escape to freedom on the Underground Railroad after moving to Battle Creek. What symbols was she was a strong Black woman. And Ida B. Wells was another um, Black woman that inspired me. Um, she was known for the anti-lynching crusade in the USA in 1890. She was journalist, activist, fought for women's suffrage. The Fury journalist, lecturer, and civil rights worker was militant, fearless efforts to expose violence against Black Americans. She was born July the 16th, 1862, died March 25th, 1931. She was 68. She had liver disease, kidney disease. Um, then there was Fannie Lou Hamer. She was born October the 6th, 1917, and she died March the 14th, 1977. Fannie Lou Hamer fought for the Black voters' rights because if you were born in America with a Black face, you're in this mess. That was one of her sayings. And she also used to say, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." She brought that out. And now we bought out the Black slate that endorses to serve our interests, Black or white. um, what was important that my African American teacher wanted me to know was about the Brown versus Education, the Board of Education, and Plessy versus Ferguson. Racial segregation in schools were unconstitutional, and landmark decision by U.S. Supreme Court fought to overturn the separate but equal doctrine that their predecessors had endorsed in the courts in 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision. Brown itself was a coordination law of lawsuits against school districts in Kansas, South Carolina, Delaware, and Virginia, and the District of Columbia. They chronicled the impact of segregation on children and families was critical to success of the LDF, the LDS litigation to separate African American children from others similar of age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to the status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. Brown, too, had to wait a year, and even then, the courts were unwilling to establish firm timetable for dismantling segregation. It ruled only that public schools designated with desegregated with deliberate speed. It was not done until 1968, Green versus County School Board and Swan versus Charlotte McKeldick, 1971 Supreme Court issued mandates that separation be dismantled root and branch. So I have an experience where the community I live in is predominantly white, and so is my church and most of my constituents. Now, Black church and the people that are mostly white. I'm a schizophrenia group leader, and I see to it that we are treated fairly, and we treat other people fairly, regardless of the cause. And we desegregated the church, and there are only a handful of Spanish and Blacks. And you would wonder why you don't see any more of another culture. I feel the church will soon grow. I am there to make a difference and to follow Christ. Without me, there wouldn't be a full knowledge of the restoration of the gospel of the last dispensation. Black History Spotlights 44th, 44th President. By winning the 2008 presidential election, Barack Obama effectively opened the door that many Americans felt wasn't available to them. He was the most admired public figure in the world by citizens and world leaders alike. During his tenure, he cut the employment rate, secured health care for all Americans, saved the U.S. auto industry, and was a major ally in the fight for marriage and equality. So that's my part, and I turn it over to Tarik, my grandson, Tarik Daniels, my grandson.
Thank you, Grandma, and thank you, Sandy, for allowing me to be here today. I don't know if I have as much as knowledge and facts and a great layout that you had, Grandma, but I definitely can talk about my experiences and around Black History Month and what it means to me. I know some of the stuff you guys asked me to, I am Tarik Daniels, like stated, and I did start a mental health organization around 6 years ago called What's in the Mirror. And really, the goal was growing up in a family that mental health was always prominent in a conversation. I felt like I wanted to do my part with bringing awareness to communities of color, specifically Black communities around mental health and resources and just more information and, really try to um, in this mental health crisis that sometimes communities of colors go through in silence, and no more silence. So What's in America was birthed in that way to be a resource here in Austin, Texas. And I bring that up because, again, that's an organization that was started to enrich and bring more to my community and in the Black community. And when I think about Black History Month, I think about, for me, growing up in Detroit, right? And I think about growing up with my grandmother who just did the presentation. I think about my great grandmother, great grandfather, and my mother growing up in the Shrine of Black Madonna, which is a church that really, really prize on Black nationalism and knowing who you are and really being aware of your Blackness. So I definitely was raised being aware of my Blackness. I was raised being aware of the Black leaders before me. And if I didn't know, I was raised to really find out what that means to know your ancestry, to know your history, to read books. If y'all don't know, my grandmother is a profound reader. I think over my lifetime, she has probably I've at least have seen 10,000 books with my own eyes. And I can imagine, right? I came way after, and I'm pretty sure she's still collecting books to this day. And I always say, people don't read because there's a lot of information, on paper. And so I've always been challenged and I've always had that opportunity to learn about people before me and know what it meant to be Black in America, what it meant, about the Atlantic slave trade, what it meant growing up in Detroit. I'm reading a book right now called Black Detroit. And by Herb, I can think of Herb Boyd. And it really has opened my eyes about what Detroit went through. My grandmother brought up the Detroit Rebellion or the 1967 riots that happened in Detroit, but it actually happened in a lot of different metropolitan cities across the country. And, one thing we like growing up in Detroit and being proud of Detroit, Detroit was one of the first actual big cities, post Civil War, even contributing to what we know as the Civil War to happen. And we talked about the Underground Railroad. We just talk about all these things that we know about history and then all these unsung heroes in Detroit. And this book has helped me understand that. Again, I've always felt that presence growing up in Detroit, but I didn't know, right? I didn't know those names where, we always hear about the big names and we come to Black history and Black History Month, but they don't teach you about the neighborhood heroes that really impact what we do on a national level. And so again, when I think about Black history, I really do think about Detroit. Now, I haven't lived back home since I was 17, so that's about 21 years ago since, I graduated from high school. And now I'm located in Austin, Texas. And so it takes me I've really been trying to find that again, right? Like going back to Detroit and figuring out my history and filling out my ancestors and thinking about my grandmother, my great grandmother, my grandfather, being a part of the Eastern Stars and the Masonry, and really the impact of Henry Ford on my family. Like my grandfather worked at Henry Ford, and now all this stuff that I'm learning about Henry Ford that I really didn't know, right? And not necessarily good stuff, but I didn't know that those things impacted my, ancestry and my history of what my family went through, and even all about the Black migration. Like, how did my family get to Detroit? And so, it sounds great to hear about it from like scholarly people who just that work, but it's the same fulfillment when you kind of do your own research for yourself and your own history and really trying to connect those dots as you get older and connect the stories that you've heard all along, but also learn about people who's had impact before you were even born. And so to add to that, when I think about some spotlights, I am a mental health advocate. I am a person that advocates for people living with HIV. I'm also a person that is identified as Black and queer. So when I think about that, I always think about intersectionality, right? Like, what does it mean to be Black and queer in America? What does it mean to be Black and living with a mental health condition in America? Like, those things they work together, right? They're not one of itself. It's the intersectionality of our identities and stuff. And so I think about the work that I do in Black communities and queer communities and even communities that are of those living with mental health conditions. And so some people that come to mind that I've studied on a personal note, as an artist, I'm also a writer. And so What's in the Mirror is an art organization. We produce theater projects, writing prompts. We use art festivals, and we use art to really bring awareness to mental health conditions and issues and resources and stuff like that. And so I think about James Baldwin, right? He has definitely been a really big inspiration throughout my life. I think the first book I read was Giovanni's Room. And I read Giovanni's Room probably at the age of 13, thinking it was a contemporary book, not knowing that that book was written in 1950, right? Something, I don't know the exact date, I think 1956, And when I think about James Baldwin, when I go back and watch his interviews as a, Black queer civil rights activist, of course, as a writer, a playwright, all of those things that I want to be, he speaks as if it's 2023. Like his interviews is so ahead of his time. Like even his literature, like Giovanni's Room, Go Tell It on the Mountain. These are books that's expressing, queerness, that expressing Blackness, that is expressing conditions of Black and queerness in these countries way before there was like a gay liberation movement, right? Way before the Stonewall riots, And so these were things that definitely wasn't talked about in a way. Like it was radical work. It was radical writings from a radical thinker who dealt with the intersectionality of Black people, right? It wasn't just enough to be Black. It was also the idea that we were queer. It was also the idea of being unequal and having to deal with equality or equity. And so I'm really always inspired by James Baldwin, boldness, his fearlessness. Like I said, like you would think that, the TV and growing up in Black history, you think about the 60s or 70s, it don't seem like a James Baldwin was able to exist, right? Things like he would got beaten or assassinated, all these things that we always hear about great leaders of that time. And he would just be on TV doing these interviews, just speaking it like it was, And I felt like it definitely took that special magic of being able to live that intersection life where he understood the importance of being fearless and telling it like it was. And so I try to aspire to do that. It's a lot of big tackles that I take on, being in a community like Austin, Texas, right? Yes, raised in Detroit, understand what all that Blackness feels like and being around you. Now I'm in a city where the population of Black people is less than 12%. So I'm in a different, situation, but the work for equity still exists. And so, when I think of Black History Month, I think about, well, this is 12 times, 12 months a year, really trying to find space for Black people. Austin, Texas is the biggest city in the country with the highest growing population with a shrinking Black population. We know gentrification, right, is a huge thing. They try to make Austin a new LA, it's the tech place to be. So all the historical neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods and stuff like that has been pushed out to the suburbs. And so space, right? Finding space to exist and identity. And again, you intersection that with finding space for Black queer people. And it's even more of a task if you're trying to find resources for Black people who could and possibly are living with mental health conditions. So that work is there. And so I take that on. Another great person that I really, outside of James Baldwin, is another Black queer writer, Joseph Bean. He was a civil rights, more so late 80s civil rights, but mainly about the rights of Black queer people, but also people living with HIV. The HIV epidemic uh, definitely impacted the Black community at way different alarming rates than it did the white community. And a lot of the stories that we've seen depicted around the AIDS epidemic of the 80s have very, very not shown the reality of Black people, right? Like you would think it was this disease that white people died from, and it was all, but we know that more Black people die from HIV, way more, well, proportionally, way more than in white counterparts. And Joseph Bean was very inspiration in writing and really telling the discrimination that Black people went through of trying to get medication, trying to find spaces, trying to survive an epidemic that was hitting the Black community without any resources, right? Trying to get DC and Washington to come up with preventative medication or just treatments for people living with HIV. And just around the discrimination that Black people went through, the Black queer community went through during the AIDS epidemic. And so if you haven't heard of Joseph Bean, or Marlon Riggs, he has a documentary called Untied Tongues. And definitely take a little bit more look into um, their work and their contributions to Black history. Because again, it's intersectionality, right? Like being Black, being queer, being people living with HIV, people who could be living with mental health conditions, people who are impoverished, people who are homeless. All of those things impact the end result, or the discrimination that they might experience, because it just don't stop, right? Like just because someone is Black, if they're Black and homeless, that is a totally different experience of its own, trying to figure out how to find resources for the unhoused and stuff like that. And so that's my approach to Black history. And that's what I continue to do, even in the work around mental health, right? That intersectionality and trying to find ways to make stuff more equitable, not equal, and really looking to my ancestors who came before me, who risked it all to get us where we are. And so the fight continues, the work continues. We are in a better place than we were, but it's so much more work and there's so much inequity that's happening. And so this must just remind us to be proud of who we are and give us a refuge to continue the work, right? This is celebration month, but we know that, it's hard all year round. But that's what Black History Month means to me. So thank y'all for being here, allowing me to say that. I didn't know exactly what I was gonna say, but I hope that was okay.
That was great. And when I talked to Zuhura about doing this interview, she asked me to also share my role models who are Black. And I want to start by mentioning Harriet Tubman. I remember learning about her in elementary school. I was so impressed by her strength to not only escape slavery, but to help many other people. As a free woman, she shattered the glass ceiling by leading armed forces. Since I'm a person with a brain disorder combating stigma, her story continues to inspire me to help people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia-related disorders live a high-quality life. My next group of African Americans are all writers. I write poetry in my spare time and I enjoy reading books like your grandma. I remember watching The Color Purple by award-winning Alice Walker. I read the book itself and many others, including The Temple of My Familiar. These books gave me insight into the African American culture. The next author is Nikki Giovanni, a poet. I remember purchasing her book, Cotton Candy on a Rainy Day, in high school. I tried to model my poetry style after hers. Finally, of course, known to many as Maya Angelou. This award-winning writer also wrote poetry. So I want to thank you all so much for being here today and celebrating this month. Does anybody have any final comments?
Yes, my final comment is that we're we're in the exact place that we need to be. Um, so the theme for this month celebration is resistance. We are not letting these things happen to us without doing anything about them. You know,
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Zuhura, and thank you, Tarik. Please make sure you subscribe to our Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance YouTube channel. We're now at 1,000 subscribers. That way
oh,
you won't miss an interview.